African economy is struggling, and Treasury is slashing a whopping 261 billion rand in spending over the next 3 years. Some civil society groups worry that the poor and vulnerable, as we've just showed you in the last few minutes, are being neglected to bail out state-owned enterprises. For more on this, I'm joined in studio by Daniel McLaren, a senior researcher at Section 27. So there, I was reading it out there, Daniel. The minister calls it readjustments, but in reality we're talking about cuts, and they include cuts to education infrastructure. How worried are you about this?
Yeah, we are concerned. The slant of this budget is very much on expenditure reductions, 261 billion rand over the 3 years, as you've said. And we are very concerned that that is not the approach that's going to take us out of our economic, social difficulties that we're experiencing. But also in relation to education, also goes against court orders requiring the state to actually fix school sanitation in particular, where we know the learners are faced with really unsafe conditions, or even drowning and suffering total indignities and death at the hands of schools where the toilets aren't even safe, and the schools themselves can't provide a safe learning environment.
So when they talk, for instance, about this reductions will cause revisions to infrastructure plans and delays in project completion, what jumps out for you? We've got the Sanitation Appropriate for Education program that is running to try and eradicate and get rid of the unsafe pit latrines, although we still have at least some 2,000 schools that have those across the country, but also such things as water, electrification of schools, classrooms that are not proper. Are those the things you worry about?
Yeah, and look, this follows a 10-year trend actually in the education sector, slightly less so in health, but certainly in education, of declining spending by the state. You know, the justification given is that about a decade ago, education spending wasn't as efficient as it could be, so rather improve the efficiency of spending. But the fact is that over time, the spend per learner has been reduced. And the story of infrastructure is part of that larger story of cuts to education spending, which are now translating into larger classroom sizes, into the poorest schools actually being underfunded, so below even the minimum legislated amount. And yeah, this will literally mean, you know, a school which has totally out of date, totally unimproved pit latrines that was scheduled for an upgrade next year to make those safer, hygienic, are not going to get that upgrade.
What will you say to someone who says, I saw your statement framing it along the lines of, you know, bailing out state-owned entities. What will you say to someone who says there simply isn't money, we have to cut? You know, here and there, the cuts have to happen, and also someone who will say this is the reality that we would be faced with if, you know, things got to a point where we were forced to make the cuts, force-fed this treatment by the IMF, for example.
Yeah, look, I mean, we work with the Budget Justice Coalition as Section 27, a number of organizations, and, you know, the analysis overall of all these organizations is that this is an austerity budget. And what austerity means is that you're prioritizing reducing public debt by cutting spending on government services. And we think that the logic of austerity, which has been debated a lot internationally for the last 20 years, is a faulty logic. It's been shown in lots of different countries, from Greece to Argentina, including our own continent in the 1960s when austerity was applied, that it doesn't work to reduce the public debt. And the reason for that is because when you take government spending out of the economy, government spending is 1 in every 4 rands in South Africa, then you actually reduce the size of the economy, and that makes it harder to generate all of the things that you need for growth, and it obviously makes it harder to pay back the public debt in the long run. So we think the overall approach in the budget isn't actually necessary. We think that there's options in South Africa, as the most unequal country in the world, to actually raise more revenue from the 10% of people who own so much of our wealth, from big companies which are being successful but which are moving their profits overseas, as well as high income earners. I mean, we think it's a little bit crazy logic that, and we don't want to poo-poo the personal tax relief, but that people earning R1 million or more will actually get tax relief in this budget, but people who are dependent on public services, who are attending these underfunded schools, are seeing their budgets cut. We don't think that's a balanced budget.
In fact, I see from your statement that you've been able to quantify it in real terms, what these amount to per learner. You're saying it's 810 rand.
That's right.
Yeah.
If you calculate what was spent on the education sector last year and you just divide it by the number of learners in the public education system, the real cut to education spending next year is 810 rand per learner. Yeah.
What's the implication, lastly, Daniel, of the cuts to the health budget over the next 3 years? This is a time when we are saying we are fixing our infrastructure in health in preparation for the NHI, but realistically now we are being told that some of the programs related to the National Health Insurance will have to happen over a much longer time frame.
Yeah, look, I mean, I would say that most planners involved in NHI aren't surprised, imagined it would take a longer time horizon anyway, because the Treasury has never really shown an indication to put up the money to go ahead with NHI in a quicker time frame. I mean, what we've said at Section 27 is we're happy that the NHI Fund Office is being set up. But health systems change of this magnitude has to be implemented over a longer time frame. So if this does mean that we do think through the changes that are made, that we do more kind of experimental methods, we don't just try and implement an entire change at once, that's not a bad thing. At the same time, based on the previous conversation about this being an austerity budget, you know, if you're not fixing your clinics, if you're not hiring doctors, and that's what's happening, then you're not going to be putting in the foundations of a national health insurance now, next year, or the year after that.
Lastly, at a philosophical, legal point, you mentioned the court cases that have gone before that have to do with socio-economic rights. And when we talk, you know, education, health, and provision of housing, we are well within that realm of socio-economic rights and the responsibilities of our state. Do the cuts that we are seeing over the next 3 years risk government falling short of its constitutional obligations in respect of these socio-economic rights, or would that be blowing it out of proportion?
We think that this is a question worth asking. I mean, there's an economic debate which we have to have as a country, but the Constitution requires that the right to access to healthcare services is progressively realized. So every year the state has to take measures to ensure greater access, improve quality. It's a similar situation in education. So when there's actual regression, when you say that you're going to cut spending, there's a very high legal bar for you to get across to show that you have looked for all the available options other than cutting the spending. Cutting the spending has to be the last option. So we're actually having a workshop on Monday, and we will write a short report and tweet about that with lawyers, with advocates, with similar organizations, where we're going to be looking at this question of, you know, in a situation of austerity when there's less money going around, what does that mean for advocating and for using the Constitution to advance these rights?
Daniel, thank you so much for coming through and sharing your insights. Daniel McLaren, who is a senior researcher at Section 27. You are up